Welcome everyone to In Cloud We Trust, common Microsoft 365 attack techniques to bypass defenses. As a matter of an agenda, I'm just going to go over who am I. I'm going to try to move very quickly. You should have the slide deck in the community resources within the Discord. The recording will also be out in the coming weeks as well. So if you want to catch up or as we go through different techniques and bypasses, feel free to look at the videos or reach out to myself if you have specific questions. We'll be first outlining the specific cloud security risks and why I felt motivated to first create this session. The specific techniques and bypasses that I'll showcase have been well researched. They're not necessarily novel. I mentioned in the pre-show banter that we just had, but a lot of the research that's gone in takes quite a bit of time from community members. They're investigating different ways, combining different thoughts and perspectives. And I'm hoping that I can shed some light in terms of how we use these bypasses, how we've assisted those community efforts, and something you can take away from understanding this is at least how we look at it from a red team perspective and how offense can inform defense. So we'll be looking at specifically Microsoft Teams bypasses and how to bypass a splash page warning, which I'll get into in a moment. Conducting phishing attacks or social engineering-based techniques using Microsoft Direct Send, and then finally abusing CDNs and static websites. Throughout, I'll try my best to include some defensive recommendations of how to prevent these bypasses. I'll also close with some thoughts about what that bypass actually means. That's usually a pretty hot topic of that gets people riled up in the information security community or red teamers themselves when we talk about bypasses or evasions. So brief introduction of who am I? I've been working in offensive security for almost 6 years, part of the Dense Secure group by Wolf & Company. Really just a branding exercise. You can find my LinkedIn, Twitter, and our website as well if you're interested. I initially started in the field performing IT audits, which is not as not as interesting or fun as penetration testing, at least in my opinion now, but definitely important and helped me understand configurations, performing reviews, and really assisting clients with their issues, which helped me get the background and knowledge of then figuring out how to break in and hack into different organizations using my skills. I'm also interested in mathematics and security, so I graduated with a degree in mathematics, and with all my presentations, I like to take these lessons from my professors, where we start with a first fundamental understanding of what the actual problems are and where we got here to first motivate why we're going to why these bypasses exist or where it really comes from and how we use them. So just understanding cloud security risks. This is a prior report, the CrowdStrike report from 2023. I mainly did this from just looking at the backwards, looking at trends and takeaways that we saw. CrowdStrike take their metrics. Obviously, every security company that comes with these types of annual reports will have different varying metrics, but they ultimately get pretty close. Really, the only purpose here is for you to understand that they had a note about steady increases in cloud-conscious attack methods back in the 2022 review, when they published this report in 2023. The latest one just came out in 2024, and some others, Unit 42 had a different report that came out as well. But what we've seen, at least the trends that these companies and researchers have found, is that cloud-based attacks have risen by 75%. Upwards, that's pretty much the metric that we see in terms of looking at it. So we're obviously focusing on Microsoft 365 since that's usually where we've seen a lot of our clients go, and many organizations have adopted cloud technologies to support remote hybrid work. You're integrating Exchange Online, have Microsoft Teams, and ultimately what we find is that many of our clients either did that very quickly. They adopted cloud services at a rate that was not really seen in terms of how quickly different technologies are adopted and risk assessments are performed, or due diligence in terms of what security configurations. That's been sometimes missed, especially the misunderstanding with the shared responsibility model as it relates to adopting these cloud technologies. And that has consequences. So we'll go through what that actually means and these types of features that Jason mentioned initially, and what they actually mean to us as attackers and what we can do with them. So just an example, in November 2023, there's a really good link here describing this attack, but I'll let you try and guess if some people may know what this actual breach was. But even Microsoft themselves, they're vulnerable to these types of cloud-based attacks. We saw in November 2023, a Russian state-sponsored actor, they were able to perform a password-based attack, mainly just by guessing. They guessed a credential and gained and compromised the production Entra environment and attempted to exfiltrate emails and were unsuccessful. So something to think about that even Microsoft or other cloud providers, and we're focusing on Microsoft here, not to shame them, but just to give an example of, yes, cloud-based attacks and adversaries are now looking for the foothold to gain credentials or gain that initial foothold in the cloud to then what we commonly refer to in the industry to perform that horizontal movement, shifting from the cloud technologies and infrastructure onto the on-premises network itself. So keep that in mind. Credential theft, a lot of the techniques that we're going to be talking about is mainly social engineering based, thinking about ways that we can collect credentials. And with a credential to the cloud, it's a lot different than what it means with an on-premises Active Directory network credential. I'll use that as the best example because in Active Directory, for example, you'll log into your workstation. There's a domain controller that'll validate your authentication details, and you can access network resources. There's groups, obviously, that you have assigned to you, but groups in Entra and Microsoft are a lot different. So just keep that in mind in terms of where the credentials and how you're pivoting and moving to different resources is going to obviously look a lot different in the cloud, and how you can potentially make that shift from the horizontal jump from hybrid cloud environment to on-premises, the network itself. So here's the high-level cloud-specific risks themselves. Like I mentioned it, we've seen the rate of adoption of cloud security services has increased over time. Not surprisingly, most of you are probably using some sort of form of hybrid technology like we are. We use Microsoft Teams. We have Exchange Online, SharePoint, OneDrive. The key point there is that when you subscribe or have access to, at least I'll use Microsoft as an example, you're not just getting one set of service or feature. You're not just getting Exchange Online. Really what you're getting is identity services in the background. And that identity is critical to think about because that allows the end user or the user that we're going to be talking about in terms of who we may be targeting for credentials and access to the cloud environment. That user may have different capabilities that they have in their profile. They may be able to register applications. They may be able to spin up different infrastructure in the background. And that's really where it kicks off in terms of a lot of our clients and aren't aware that these features are enabled by default. That's where the security concerns come from. And that's really where these bypasses are going to come into play as we get into it. So with that, a brief overview in terms of where we got here. Let's first talk about the first bypass that we have for today's session, which is Microsoft Teams. So by default, Microsoft Teams, if you didn't know, is enabled for external communications. What that it really means is that I, as a user of the wolfandco.com domain, can send a message to an external user of any organization. So if an external organization is using Microsoft Teams themselves and their employees are using Teams maybe internally, I can use an external domain. I can even create my own tenant, for example. So for the sakes of demonstrations, I can create a Microsoft subscription in the cloud and subscribe to, with a domain of something like mostoffensivecon.com. Let's just use that as a hypothetical scenario. And I can use that domain, create a user, and apply a license for Microsoft Teams for that user, and then start sending messages to external users. Now, Microsoft is obviously aware that there's social engineering-based attacks and opportunities there. So what was done was there's a splash page that gets presented. I'll have a slide in terms of what that actually looks like. But if I, as an external user, message someone in a different organization, not tied to the same domain, there's no trust, there is essentially a splash page, which will get presented, warning that end user, the victim that gets that message, that they need to approve or preview the message, where they can either approve to communicate with that external party or they can deny it. That's similar to maybe what you're more familiar with emails of you maybe in your organization have created a red warning banner of this is an external sender. Please review any links and ensure that the person that you're talking to is actually real and they're legitimate with their request. So kind of a similar thought. So there's a security researcher that came out with several ways to bypass that splash page. There are 3 in total. The first 2, which we'll get into in a little bit, don't no longer work, but there's a third one that got created, and we helped integrate into the Teams Phisher tool. Teams Phisher is a tool that allows you to automate social engineering-based attacks against Microsoft Teams. So that essentially means that, yes, you can send messages individually. So I can go create that Microsoft Teams account with the most offensive con domain that I was talking about. and I could do that manually of trying to incorporate that bypass. Teams Phishing, it has a lot of different features. It was created by Alex Reed, who was previously at Red Siege. So please take a look at his research. Like I said, there's a lot that goes into this, a lot of different people working on this in the background. So please take a look at that and do your due diligence of just reviewing how the code actually works and what the tool has to offer, since we just don't have the time to fully dive in. The main functionality there is, though, it can send messages and attachments from external users to internal users. There was an issue. I didn't post the name since I'm not trying to shame people or whatever the case is, but I got interested in this because I saw that blog post of how to bypass the splash page from P5 T-Day. Probably got that wrong. Unfortunately, I don't know their first name, but they have a really good blog post that combined or educated red teamers of how that actually works, of how to do it manually. And I saw this issue get posted on the tool. So rather than recreate the wheel, I started thinking of, wait a second, there may be a simple way to integrate this code. Instead of just creating a new tool in their security field, we constantly make these new tools that kind of do the same thing. I really wanted to at least do this as an exercise for myself of figuring out, okay, can I update this tool with this new bypass to help automate and at least educate people of that this bypass exists, this risk exists, and is being used by red teamers, APT groups, et cetera, targeting critical infrastructure. That was the issue that got posted on the tool page itself. This is what the splash page looks like. So I just messaged myself. I know it's still working. I sent a message. It may be a little bit confusing because I'm using the same name, but you can see that my global admin account, Alex Martirosian, sent a message to my own identity, Alex Martirosian, and this is what it looks like for the victim. They receive this message in their little Teams chat. They maybe get notified that someone wants to talk to them outside of your organization. You can either block or accept that. And that's the default setting. If you have not restricted communications within Teams, this is what people are going to see. As a red teamer, this is still somewhat attractive, though, because I could do a double-pronged attack. I can send a message of, I have the ability to control that display name, Alex Martirosian GA. I could have named it Most Offensive Con Help Desk, or I could have done some other name that's going to align with a pretext or what I'm not looking to accomplish, maybe gather those credentials or include a phishing link into the actual message. And that is still an opportunity where maybe I can call that individual or send them an email saying, hey, you just got this chat. Can you please approve that message? That's a real legitimate request. So think about that in mind where, yes, although this is at least a obstacle, it's not something that can be at least preventing the entire attack from ever occurring, even if that splash page is still there. So how does a bypass actually work? Previously, the two ways, the blog post link is there for the newest one. Previously, the two ways was to send a group chat and invite the target twice. So you're essentially just creating a group chat. You can name it whatever you want, invite them twice, and then you can start sending the messages, no splash page. That got fixed. Microsoft fixed it. The second bypass that existed was send a meeting invite, and you can send a meeting invite, create any chat. You have to change some parameters in Microsoft Teams itself when you're setting up that meeting. But if all goes well, you send a meeting invite. You can use then in your calendar in Outlook or Microsoft Teams, the view, you can actually chat with participants in the actual meeting itself. And that also bypassed the splash page. Those don't work anymore. But the latest one that is working is you can create your group chat and then remove yourself or the user from the chat itself. And that is working. So I wanted to integrate this into Teams Phishing. This is what the code looks like. I don't have time to really go into the specifics, but it was actually relatively simple where a lot of the code, the way that Alex Reed actually structured it was well thought out, where all I needed was really just this one function call to kind of figure out, okay, what do we actually need to do? Look at this from a manual perspective of how do we want to actually implement this bypass and then put it into actual code. So this is what the code actually looks like. Again, you can look at the pull request and see the details for yourself, but it's actually quite trivial. All we're doing is creating that group chat that already existed and then deleting the target from the actual chat itself, and no splash page will be presented to the point that it looks like this. So traditionally, when I showed you the initial preview message, I showed you the one that would happen if you didn't implement the bypass, but now you can see what the actual message looks like with the bypass. So this is now can be used for social engineering-based attacks. We can provide a link. The Teams Phishing tool allows you to provide attachments with different processes from SharePoint. And this is, again, something that we have control over as an actor, a threat actor. We can control that display name. We can control what we put in the content. And Teams is widely used now, where if you've ingrained it into your own environments, a lot of your end users are going to see that. I can maybe notify them with an exclamation point, right? I can at them. I can make sure that they're seeing that urgent message and see what is happening. But I can say something along the lines of, "Hey, your device is out of compliance. Here's a link to update it. Please, please do this as soon as possible." And if they say the name, it's not an email anymore. Are they aware of this type of attack? So Teams Fisher uses device codes for authentication. So when you spin up the tool and are authenticating, you need to authenticate to Microsoft Teams and SharePoint to use it. So that's also another idea of how you can actually collect credentials. Since using Microsoft Teams, you can't just put a .exe and hope that someone's going to click and download it. You're going to run into smart screen and different defenses that Microsoft has implemented. But you can start using different techniques to then successfully gain credentials and use Teams as a vector for social engineering. Device code phishing has been a pretty hot item for red teamers. There's tools like Token Tactics, and Steve Borish and other red teamers came together and they created Graph Runner, for example, was recently released by Black Hills. There's different ways to collect these potential credentials where instead of just asking them to maybe download a link, download an attachment, I can direct them to a Microsoft trusted resource like Microsoft.com/device login, generate a code for them, and now I potentially have access to their accounts and can use other tools in the background to facilitate my access in the network or the cloud network. This is how you fix it. So if you didn't know, Microsoft also released a way to audit who's actually communicating with external domains, but you can go through the settings here in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, remove the ability to communicate with external domains. Yes, people will still be able to create meeting invites as long as you support anonymous access. So if that's a concern with admins, you can certainly test this, but I would highly encourage you to remove this default just so nobody can abuse this Teams bypass. Since I just tested it earlier today, just to check if it was still working. At this point, this is still a valid way to send those potential phishing phishing messages. Yes, there is an opportunity cost there where you remove the user from the victim so they can't reply. So the red teamer, there's a cost there, but we've been successful to use it in these types of campaigns where we're asking individuals to update their device by logging in with the device code and different ways to collect credentials to gain initial access. Next abuse, direct send, a feature called Microsoft Direct Send that Steve Borish originally researched. Blog post is there. This is obviously his credit and the research that they've gone through, but we've been using it at our DenSecure group for our external pen test to achieve initial access, the same way we've been using Microsoft Teams. On the right, you'll see the BIHAS backdoors and breaches card deck, expansion deck that we've created to at least highlight the significance of this attack. I'm not aware of any threat actors using this technique. I don't know if we have the data or if they actually are aware of it, but this feature, Microsoft Direct Send, was originally created for on-premises exchange online. So for email servers internally, that was used in the background, and mainly for IoT devices, networking devices like printers that don't have a browser, you wanted to still send emails if a print job was done or completed. That was really what Direct Send was there for. And it just happened to also get integrated to the cloud. The key word there is there's no browser or really interaction between those devices. So that means it's unauthenticated. Unauthenticated means that I can identify your smart host is what Azure calls it, but there's an Azure smart host where I can identify your domain. This is the format that would look like. There's a -com, which is important to think about. But for example, for Wolf & Co, for our domain, it would be wolfandco.com. And that's the endpoint that I'm going to be communicating to. And Steve Borish identified a very trivial way to send emails to this gateway of I can communicate to this specific Azure Smart Host, send a email from impersonating the from address. So I can choose an external domain and internal domain. As long as the target organization is using Exchange Online and the inbox is valid and synced to Microsoft 365, you're able to send messages while unauthenticated and spoofing external or internal domains. That's quite significant. So please test this if you haven't. You can send, it's kind of a black box. You know it got sent, but you're unaware of if it actually got delivered, if it got caught up in junk. And what I mean by that is the way to test this, the best way I think, and what Steve Borish outlined is you can spawn an Azure Cloud Shell. Once you have a Cloud Shell, you have a IP address that's assigned by Microsoft. That's a feature. If you spin up your own tenant, you can spin up an Azure Cloud Shell and have access to PowerShell. That PowerShell command line's already built in. You don't need to install any additional modules. Identify that correct smart host, which is oftentimes just a domain name, like I talked about. And from there, you can send phishing emails with that PowerShell commandlet. Now, it is a black box, and the pretext may vary. So if you spoof domains like Microsoft, we've seen that not really work the best. But oftentimes we see administrators create an allow list of domains that can communicate to their domain. That's definitely going to get through. There's different success rates based on how different organizations set up their rules. So, for example, if they're using a third-party gateway like Mimecast, Proofpoint, a lot of times we find that we're more successful compared to the Microsoft spam filtering. I'm not sure what magic they have going on in the background to prevent or block those types of emails. So just keep that in consideration. If you have not tested direct send, it is trivial to test. You can have an IT admin create a test environment and just simply send out that PowerShell commandlet and check if you're vulnerable to that abuse. The fix is here. There's two different fixes that we typically recommend. The first is a connected rule. The connected rule here is created for Mimecast. It can be extended for Proofpoint and really anything that you're using. And the idea there is that, well, all mail should be flowing through your security gateway. So in this case, it's Mimecast. And the really important part that is maybe a little bit difficult to see, so take a look at the slides to really check this if you haven't. But make sure you use a star regex when you're creating a connector rule for how to identify your partner organization. The reason a star regex is important because then you can apply those IP blocks. So you can apply your IP blocks for each gateway they're using. So if it's Mimecast, those IPs listed there are the public Mimecast gateway IPs that a client was using and was able to block that attack entirely, where the attacker, all they see is a connector rule is established. We can't communicate to that endpoint anymore. If you're using Microsoft 365, you can't create that connector rule. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem where you can't create that connector rule since you're using Microsoft 365 or Exchange. That's where you can enforce, and this is an article from JumpSec themselves. This is the best one that I saw, at least to mitigate that threat entirely in Microsoft, is by enforcing an SPF hard fail within Exchange Online. That then results in those messages most of the time just leading to quarantine and junk completely. Nobody would even be able to interact with it unless it got approved to be sent out. So yeah, definitely take a look at that. Read the research done by Steve Borage and test out your own gateways, because that's it's bizarre to me since it's such a significant attack where I can impersonate and spoof any domain that I want. And what's even scarier to me is that when you look at Outlook, it'll actually line up if the external user was sent email before. It'll line up the LinkedIn profile. It'll line up different details about the contact information and look like as if it was sent there. But if you look at the message source, it came from Azure IP because we're using the Azure Cloud Shell, etc. Finally, CDN abuse. I have a couple more minutes. I'll go as quickly as I can here. CDN Abuse is to combine these two different bypasses or techniques that we talked about. It's one thing to send a phishing email to a random bad domain, right? You may have a great web filter in place, a lot of DNS block lists, and whatever you're doing in the background to ensure that, okay, even if an attacker does send a phishing link through, whether they're using Microsoft Teams, direct send, or even just traditional mail phishing, where they're just setting up their own infrastructure for it, CDNs are a really great way that we've been successful of still ensuring that an end user or victim is able to get to our content. And that's done in two ways. One is we can use CDNs because they're already trusted by Azure and AWS, a content delivery network. These are the resources that allow you to go to websites, and usually they're storing images or different content already. So it's already cached. It's the browser can easily pull this different data. That's usually the use case for CDNs, but they're publicly available, meaning that anyone can use them. So I could spin up the default AzureEdge.net CDN. I could use a CloudFront.net CDN. And most of the time, these are already enabled and authorized by your web filter tool because they're trusted. They're trusted entities. You're going to get the lock icon within Google Chrome. You get a TLS certificate already complete. So a lot of that setup is already done for you. So what that means is if I'm using tools and techniques here of masking my command and control infrastructure. For example, if I create a Cobalt Strike infrastructure server, I can create a CDN as my redirector. Or if I'm using EOLGenX to send direct send emails, and my link becomes an AzureEdge.net link instead of a different link to a bad domain. What that actually looks like in the background for command and control, for example, I can create a CDN within Azure itself. Then the top screenshot, that's within Azure. The bottom one is for Amazon Web Services. For the top one, for example, I can create rules. So for my beacon, for example, that's going to communicate to an AzureEdge.net that I can choose. CloudFront, you don't have the ability to choose the subdomain. You get a random string of some 10 plus characters or so. But here I can specify different rules of my beacon will only communicate if it has this header. That header says offensive con. The header value is base 64 encoded. It says then secure. And if it doesn't align to that, I'm just going to redirect them to Azure. So I'm protecting my infrastructure in the background using this technique. A lot of this I learned and got help from Ralph May, another red teamer within Black Hills. But that sort of concept has been quite commonly used to ensure that, hey, if you're blocking domains and web filtering, CDNs are a way to get through that. And when you combine all that together with directs and abuses, with Microsoft Teams, that's where you get credentials, and you can now gain initial access to either bypass multi-factor authentication or have some sort of way in, initial foothold into the cloud environment. So this is where I'll leave off and try to answer any questions. But the Azure Threat Research Matrix is probably a widely underutilized tool to understand and classify these types of attacks that exist post-compromise. It's a really powerful resource. If you're familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, again, that's really just a classification framework to classify and make sure everyone understands the types of attacks that we talk about. So if I talk about credential dumping, or if I talk about phishing, we can all classify that with a technique ID and identifier that anyone can really understand. The Azure Threat Research Matrix is pretty much the same thing, but just applied to specifically within Azure. And that allows you to track these types of and classify these different types of attacks that happen post-compromise. And I hope that you can at least take a look at and understand that there are ways that we can abuse Microsoft or cloud providers themselves against themselves, right? We could use Microsoft's own technology to then target other customers that use Microsoft. So keep that in mind, and hopefully this has at least been useful for you to understand different types of attacks or bypasses, if we call them, within Microsoft. I'll leave that with backdoors and breaches. Please take a look for tabletop exercises. You can tabletop these types of scenarios, test direct send yourself, test a Microsoft Teams scenario yourself if you're interested, right? You can definitely playbook that out yourself and communicate to the business, right? We could say we have this theory and we know that Microsoft Teams is being used by APT groups, red teamers. What did it actually mean for us? Do we have Microsoft Teams enabled? You can come ready to and educate the business of either defenses you have implemented or hope to implement based on attacks that you know about. I went probably a mile a minute, so I'll take any questions. I really wanted to cover those three different topics, at least with my perspective and how we've been using them at our team.
Real quick housekeeping tip, if you go down to the resources tab and look in the documents, you'll be able to download the slides that Alex had today. So if you're not in Discord, you can still get them here through Zoom before we close the session. So I would go now. All right, Alex, well done. I always ask people to sum up everything with one last statement. So if you could sum up everything, what would it be? Oh,
my hot take for bypasses, always use a... Oh, am I still here?
You're here. You were muted for a second.
You still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm here. Oh, sorry. My hot take is always keep in mind with bypasses, with red teamers, when we talk about bypasses, that is kind of an odd term for blue teamers. You're usually leaving some sort of artifact and usually doing something in the background that can still be detected. So are we actually bypassing something effectively? You can notice it with what I talked about with creating CDNs, using direct send and Microsoft Teams. There's going to be artifacts left over. We're really just evading and abusing different features. So I like to use the term evasion, and I fall into that camp. So keep that in mind when we're talking about bypasses or flashing our capabilities. There's ways to mitigate and respond to these threats. So it's not like you're open-ended or left open completely. So yep, that's what I'll leave off with.
Alex, thank you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I've known you for a while. You are someone who loves to share the stuff that you know. And so hopefully the people who've learned from you will take that as inspiration to also share with the people that they know. And so if they want to connect with you, looks like you're on LinkedIn and they can connect with you in the future. To everyone that's with us today, make sure you connect with Alex. He is a fantastic contributor and a person who likes to share his knowledge. And with that, we're going to head to the last talk of the day before closing ceremonies. So we'll see you over at the last talk, and then we'll see you at closing ceremonies. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at the next talk.
Thank you.
All right, Ryan, kill it.